There's no mitzvah to believe in Hashem. Now, in the parasha this week, when we have the Aseret HaDibros, and we're told, I am Hashem your God, what exactly is that mitzvah? The Rambam tells us it's a mitzvah to know Hashem. And let's understand and appreciate what exactly that means. Kosav Rambam, B'minyan HaMitzvahs, B'tchila Sefer Mishnah Torah, the Rambam writes in his list of mitzvahs at the beginning of Mishnah Torah, we're going to quote, Mitzvah Rishonim and Mitzvah Saseh, the very first of all the positive mitzvahs is Leida, to know She'esham Eleka, that there's an Eibishter, Shenemar Noichi Havai Lekecha, as it says in the beginning of the Aseret HaDibros, I am Hashem your God. Of a mitzvah zay posach Rambam gam es halacha shebesifra Mishnah Torah. So that's in the list of mitzvahs, and the Rambam also uses that to open up his 14-volume Encyclopedia of Jewish Law by telling us Yesodos, the foundation of all foundations, v'amud hachachmos, and the pillar on which all wisdom is built is leida, to know she'esham motzirishim v'chulei, that there is an original entity from which all existence comes. Omnom, however, if the Rambam is telling us that the very first mitzvah is to know that there is an Eibishter, look at what he does next. The Rambam doesn't immediately now begin in the first halacha to tell us he doesn't tell us in the list of mitzvahs. He said the very first mitzvah is to know that there's a God. But in Mishnah Torah, he doesn't start off by saying the very first mitzvah is that you have to know that there's an Eibishter. He first goes through 5 halachas, describing all kinds of details around this original entity called the Eibishter. And only after giving us all of this detail, then he concludes in the 6th halacha, knowing all of this information is a positive mitzvah, from the same pasuk, that you have to know that the Eibishter is our God. Move on. That implies the positive mitzvah that is encapsulated in those words, I am Hashem your God, is it's not a generic awareness of the fact that there's a God, that there's an original existence. The Rambam is clearly teaching us that in order to fulfill this mitzvah, there are certain details that you have to be cognizant of. These are the details that he shares with us in the opening section of these halachas about the Eibishter. So you have to know these things in order to fulfill the mitzvah of knowing the Eibishter. Like the Abarbanel says, the Tzemach Tzedek quotes it in Mitzvah Samonos Elikus. So Rambam, according to the Rambam's view, the positive commandment to have belief in the Eibishter is not just that you should know that the Eibishter exists. Because the truth is, if the mitzvah was to believe that the Eibishter exists, that immediately raises a very obvious question. With what logic would you count belief in Hashem as a mitzvah? The whole concept of a mitzvah requires a belief in someone who commands the mitzvah. So it would be completely illogical to say there is a mitzvah to believe in one who commands mitzvahs. Self-contradictory. So therefore, rather the mitzvah is that God we already believe and know to exist. We have to understand. We have to know that the Eibishter is the very first of all existences and the most perfect existence. And the Abarbanel goes into all kinds of detail about that. That explains why before the Rambam tells us this is the mitzvah, he goes into 5 halachas worth of detail about the Eibishter's existence. Because the mitzvah of believing in, which means knowing godliness, requires us to know at least some of these details about the Eibishter's existence, which will illustrate to us how the Eibishter is the most complete out of all things that exist. So that's the Rambam's shita, that it's not just a high-level generic appreciation of the fact that there is a God, but rather you have to know details about the Eibishter. The Oid Zois will take it further. we know that we pay close attention to the Rambam's language where he says Leida sheyesh Amalekah, that you have to know that there's a God, and Leida sheyesh Amatzirushin, and you have to know that there's an original existence. And likewise, at the end of the conversation, whether it's talking about that mitzvah to know the Eibishter, or whether it's the mitzvah to acknowledge that the Eibishter is one in a very unique form of oneness, again, he tells us knowing this is a positive commandment, and not believing this is a positive commandment, which means the Rambam is telling us not only do we have to know a lot of detail, but that detail has to resonate with us intellectually. It cannot just be something that we believe. And the Abraham uses that to explain and answer a question. How do you instruct somebody what to believe? You don't choose what to believe. Obira explains, the Rambam does not describe the positive mitzvah as the definition of emunah and the truth of our faith. Rather, the Rambam says the mitzvah is to know this information, a whole lot of detailed information, and learning that information will help us to acquire faith in Hashem. That all of this inquiry and all of this exploration and all of this research and the learning that comes from it, those are the things that bring us to a state of faith, and that is what activates our motivation and our choice to actually want to believe in Hashem and connect with Hashem. With that information, we can explain why why it is that the Rambam doesn't just simply give us a whole lot of details about things you need to know about the Eibishter, but even later, we're going to focus quite a lot on this, he gives a lot more detail about halachas avodas at Sefer Perek, and the rest of the halachas continuing till the end of the chapter, including many, many things that are relevant to know about the Eibishter. He brings proofs from various scriptural references that the Eibishter has no form, and explaining why it is that the Torah will use anthropomorphic references to the Eibishter as if he has some kind of bodily function. Where he explains very clearly, the Rambam, that all of this is just to help the human mind understand and appreciate these concepts, but that it's all metaphorical. Like, for example, when Moshe Rabbeinu wanted to, so to speak, visualize the Eibishter, and what that really meant in terms of his being able to grasp something about the Eibishter's truth. You could have asked, why is all of this philosophical conversation relevant in the book of Yad HaChazaka, Sefer Halachos, which the Rambam, by his own description, calls a book which is dedicated to strict laws? So why are you getting into all this conversation about things that are unrelated to law and are more philosophical concepts? Well, now we understand why. Because all of this detail is relevant to fulfill the requirement of the Torah, the positive mitzvah, which is to know the Eibishter intellectually. Only when a person has processed all of this research and conversation and debate around these aspects that you might have taken at face value about the Eibishter, then what you know about the Eibishter, you know. It's not just abstract faith, but it's intellectually processed understanding, which is the mitzvah. Or to say that differently, in order to fulfill the mitzvah that is incumbent on us, to know the Eibishter, then we have to know at the very least, you can't know the Eibishter. So what you have to know is you have to know the fundamental principles, and you have to explore those principles about the Eibishter, all of which the Rambam explained in this parak. Now, where does the Rambam get this principle from? That the mitzvah, the first mitzvah, Anochi Hashem Elokecha, is to know intellectually Hashem and not just simply to believe in Hashem. We are going to suggest that the source of the Rambam is the meaning the source of the Rambam's two key factors over here. Number one, that to believe in Hashem, the mitzvah is not only to know in the general sense that the Eibishter exists, but to know the specifics that illustrate how uniquely perfect the Eibishter is. And number two, that it is information we have to know and appreciate with our human intellect. How does the Rambam know all of this, despite the fact that the pasuk seems to be fairly generic, just saying, I am Hashem your God? So what is the Rambam's source for this? It would appear that it comes from the Zohar, because this is what the Zohar says. That you should know that I am Hashem your God, says the Zohar. This instruction is kadmod l'chol pikudin. It is the precursor, it is the original of all of the instructions the Jewish people are giving, and what are given. And what is the instruction? To know the Eibishter, which means the shlita ilah, that there is a supernal authority, the Ribono Olma, who is the master of the universe, Obora Almin Kulo, and he created all of the world, the heavens, the earth, and everything that is within them. When you make a comparison between the Rambam's language at the beginning of Hilchos Yesodei HaTorah and the language of the Zohar, it's almost like a Hebrew translation of the Zohar. Yesod, I say this, he says this is the foundation of all foundations and the pillar of all wisdom. It's like the Zohar says, this is the original instruction that all instructions are built on. Says the Rambam, that you have to know that there's an original existence. That's like the Zohar said, you have to know the Eibishter. Then the Rambam says, he's the one who brought into existence every single thing that exists, and so therefore whatever there is from heaven and earth and in between is only a result of the truth of his existence. That's like the Zohar said, it's like the Zohar said, he created the heaven and earth and everything that is within them. Likewise, the Rambam's language in Halacha Hey, where he says that this original entity, this original existence, is the master of all the worlds, the God of all existence. That's similar also to the language of the Zohar. That there is this supernal authority who is the master of the world. So it would seem very clearly that the Rambam has based himself on the Zohar, and it's from that teaching of the Zohar that the Rambam concludes that the instruction is not just to believe in Hashem, but to know, vidatem in the pasuk, leminda in the language of the Zohar, which means to know, and it's not even good enough just to have a generic understanding or belief or a comprehension of the fact that the Eibishter exists. But you have to know details about his existence. And knowing that information, as we've already pointed out, will help us to appreciate how the Eibishter is the very original existence and the most perfect existence. You'll ask, the Rambam based it on Anochi Hashem Lekecha, which is in the Aseret Adibros, and Shebezohu v'al-kacha pasuk v'idaitem k'ani Hashem Lekechem, and the Zohar brought a different pasuk that you should know that I am Hashem your God. V'loi ha-pasuk Anochi Havai Lekecha. Well, there's a very simple reason for that. Because the Zohar at that particular point is describing how Moshe taught awareness of the Eibishter to the Jewish people even before they left Mitzrayim. In order that they should appreciate that all of the experiences they had in Mitzrayim, they should believe that these are divinely directed miracles that happened. And at that particular point in time, it was the Eibishter telling Moshe or Moshe Rabbeinu, expressing to the people about their faith in the Eibishter. That's what the Zohar is commenting on, not to exclude the pasuk Anochi Havai Lekecha. The Rambam, on the other hand, is telling us a halacha. It's not just commenting on something that happened historically, and the halacha that we have to be able to believe in and know the Eibishter, that derives, as the Rambam famously tells us with regards to bris milah, that even though the Eibishter told Avraham Avinu to have a bris, we fulfill a bris today because Moshe Rabbeinu gave it to us from Sinai, from the Eibishter. Likewise over here, the Zohar is talking about the original way that Moshe Rabbeinu explained the Eibishter to the Yidden, but we have the mitzvah Monoselikus because it was given at Har Sinai. Therefore, if I'm looking for a biblical source for the mitzvah that we have to believe in and know God, that's from the pasuk Anochi Hashem Lekecha. As the Zohar itself says elsewhere, that the very first instruction is Anochi, to know the Eibishter. Then you may have the question, if the instruction to believe in the Eibishter and to know the Eibishter comes from at Har Sinai, why is the Zohar deriving all of the details from a pasuk that predates Har Sinai? That's not a problem. That it is common for us to either expose details about something or learn new details about something from information that was there even before Matan Torah. So that's not a surprise for us. Now that we know that the Rambam is doing this, we're going to explore something else that the Rambam says, where he's going into all of these details to help us have a deep intellectual appreciation of the Eibishter, and that will address something else the Rambam does that initially would appear to be quite surprising. We can now explain something surprising about the Rambam. Up until now, we've described things that the Rambam spoke about in the first chapter, but in the second chapter of Yisro there, the Rambam talks about the fact that there's now a mitzvah to love the Eibishter and to be in awe of the Eibishter. And then he explains this. How does a person precipitate this love and fear of the Eibishter? When a person contemplates how incredible and mind-blowing the Eibishter's conduct and creation is, and he realizes that the Eibishter's wisdom is infinitely beyond anything we could imagine, that causes the person to love Hashem. And as the person comes to know more about Hashem's greatness, then he's going to be afraid. And then the Rambam says, and this is the part that may strike us as a little bit surprising, he says, because of that, I'm going to explain certain things, very important principles, from the actions of the Eibishter, that will open an opportunity for people who are more intellectually inclined, that they could come to love Hashem. After that, the Rambam then dedicates 3 whole chapters about the Eibishter's great and wondrous creation. The first parak is all about the Malachim, what the Rambam calls Ma'aseh Merkava, the understanding of the supernal works, the so-called structures of the higher world. And thereafter, he goes into 2 chapters worth of detail about the process of creation. After which he concludes, when a person contemplates this incredibly vast and complex creation and thinks about all of the entities within it, that is going to stimulate great love of Hashem and fear of Hashem. Now, that also doesn't seem to make sense. Yes, we get it. The Rambam is telling us that the path to love and fear of Hashem is certain focused meditations and contemplations. But didn't we already establish that this is a book that is dedicated to the straightforward black and white law? Why is this the place to get into the details about the meditations you should have? Say, you are required halachically to contemplate Hashem's greatness, and the expectation is, go out and find out how to do that. This book is not the guide to meditation. Even though you'd say that the Rambam's language in Sefer HaMitzvahs implies it would seem actually that all of this contemplation is not just a means to get us to the mitzvah to love Hashem, but it's actually the practicality of how you fulfill the mitzvah. The instruction to me is that I go through this process of contemplation on Hashem's greatness, which is guaranteed, says the Rambam, that that's going to stimulate love of Hashem. Despite that, must be that's not yet a good enough justification for the fact that the Rambam should include in his book, which is dedicated to halacha, what are the actual processes of contemplation, meditation that you have to follow in order to wake yourself up to have this love of Hashem? That belongs in books of Jewish philosophy or others. In other words, the dry halacha is that you have to contemplate Hashem's greatness and Hashem's great creation. Whereas the details of what all of that means, That doesn't really seem to be something which is critical to the book of Love of Hashem or to the mitzvah of Love of Hashem. It doesn't belong in this Sefer Mishnah Torah. So why does the Rambam give it so much airtime? The explanation is, as we've already pointed out, what the Rambam deals with in these 3 chapters is Siyum Ma'aser Merkava Ma'aser Bereishis, the detail about the supernal creation and the creation of the physical. And they're not just tools that you use in order to get yourself to a place of love and fear of Hashem. They're actually still part of the mitzvah of knowing Hashem. Remember that the mitzvah of knowing Hashem, according to the Rambam, is you have to know a lot of detailed information about Hashem, and this is part of that detailed information. Okay, before the Pirush al Rambam, as the Pirush al Rambam says, what is incorporated under these 2 mitzvahs, that you have to know that there's a God and know that there's no other God. In your Ma'aser Bereishis and Ma'aser Merkava, part of that understanding is to know something about the workings of the higher and lower worlds. Because once we know this information, we understand a little bit more about how the Eibishter creates and runs the world, that will help us to appreciate the Eibishter's existence more clearly, and how the Eibishter is the original source from which everything comes. That's why the Rambam's giving this as all of this information, Ma'aser Merkava, Ma'aser Bereishis, because it's going to consolidate our appreciation of the Eibishter. This is also highlighted in the Rambam's language. The Rambam tells us that this information about Ma'aser Merkava and Ma'aser Bereishis is a continuation of the earlier halacha to know the Eibishter. Where do we see that? Aleph, Perek Hasheni, in the second parak, after he goes through all of the details about the malachim and the 10 types of malachim and how they operate and that they don't necessarily the same form as we do, etc. Then he goes back to a subject he had already begun in the previous chapter, which is about the Eibishter. That the Eibishter knows himself in a very unique type of knowledge that we don't experience as humans, and in the same way he knows everything that we would consider to be external. And he goes into all this detail that Eibishter knows everything as he knows himself, and he is the knowledge, he is the knower, etc. Information about understanding who the Eibishter is and how the Eibishter operates in a conversation that was originally about Ma'aser Merkava, showing you that it's one theme. Likewise, at the end of the parak, he says, all of the information we've shared in these 2 prakim, the parak about the Eibishter's existence and the parak about Ma'aser Merkava, they are that's all in the broad category of what's called Ma'aser Merkava. Meaning to say that both chapters are conveying a single message. What is that single message? The story of Ma'aser Merkava, the spiritual reality of our existence. And then, just to consolidate further, Gimel B'Siyim, Perek Daled Kosav Rambam, at the end of the 4th Perek, the Rambam writes, V'Inyonei Abo Prakim Elu, the theme of all of these first 4 prakim of Mishnah Torah, they all fall into the category of what the Chachamim called the Paradise, which implies that all 4 chapters are one message, Paradise. In other words, they're all about understanding the Eibishter better to fulfill the positive mitzvah, which is to know Hashem. Now, why is the Rambam linking all of these fundamental principles about knowing Hashem specifically to the meditation you're supposed to have in order to produce love and fear of Hashem? Rather than just linking it straight back to the earlier parak, which was the mitzvah to know Hashem. Because the order in which the Rambam puts this all together is he's tackling those issues associated with knowing Hashem and linking them to specific mitzvahs that are related to them. Therefore, these great principles of the Ma'aser Merkava and Ma'aser Bereishis are also relevant to developing love and fear of Hashem. Therefore, the Rambam organized them in such a way that they would appear not only as a continuation of the earlier parak about knowing Hashem, but he did it in such a way that it links in to also knowing, not only knowing Hashem, but also links into developing love and fear of Hashem. This is why the Rambam over here brings these very integral or essential principles about knowing Hashem. Because in order for a person to fulfill the mitzvah, to know Hashem, what does it mean to know Hashem? Which we've already explained means that he has to have an intellectual appreciation about Hashem's existence, meaning that the Eibishter's existence is the most perfect existence. If you want to reach that point, you want to have a proper understanding and appreciation of Hashem, then you have to know also these core principles. Because knowing all of this information about Maaseh Merkava and Maaseh Bereishis, that's going to consolidate our appreciation of the Eibishter's greatness. Now, with that information, knowing that all of the details about Maaseh Merkava and Maaseh Bereishis that the Rambam includes in his Yad HaChazaka, now that we know that they are all fundamental to get to the point of fulfilling the mitzvah to know Hashem, in fact, they're part of that mitzvah. That's going to help us, as we often see, the beginning of a sefer and the end of the sefer are linked. So knowing now that this is so integral to understanding Maaseh Merkava and Maaseh Bereishis, is so integral to understanding the Eibishter very well to fulfill the mitzvah of Yedias Hashem, that links to the very end of the sefer Yad HaChazaka. Where the Rambam writes as follows: at the time of Mashiach, the engagement, the focus of the world will be nothing else except to know the Eibishter. For which reason, therefore the Jewish people will be great sages, and they will know the great secrets of the world. And they will understand the Eibishter's knowledge to the extent that human capacity can. As the pasuk says, that at that time the world will be filled with knowledge of Hashem, like the ocean is filled with water. Now, at Tzarech Lahavin, we have to understand. First of all, what are these two things? That they'll know the secret things, and they'll understand the Eibishter's knowledge. What are the two different things? Once the Rambam said that the only occupation of the world is going to be to know Hashem, that implies that these secret things are part of knowing Hashem. So what then is the difference between the hidden things and the Eibishter's knowledge? Question number 2, base. When it says to the extent of human capacity, that sounds like it's something which is specifically relevant to what? To the part where it says you know the Eibishter's knowledge. But it doesn't seem that there is that same limitation to knowing the secret information. So we need to know what's the difference then. How come there's a limitation on how much the humans can know about Das Boiram and not about Dvarim Astumim? And lastly, why is it relevant in this conversation to also at the second half of the pasuk, which says that the knowledge will be like the water is covering the ocean? Once you say that the world will be filled with the knowledge of Hashem, then we understand that relates to the principle that we will be occupied with nothing else but to know Hashem. Why does the ocean add value? Especially when you consider that back in Hilchos Tshuva, the Rambam also spoke about the time of Mashiach. Whereas there he said, at that time there'll be this tremendous increase in knowledge and wisdom and truth. And he quotes the pasuk, that the world will be filled with the knowledge of Hashem. And there he doesn't say, as the ocean fills the seabed. So why that distinction? But once you've already learned that in order to fulfill the positive mitzvah to know Hashem, we see right at the beginning of Yisro that the Rambam is telling us in order to fulfill the mitzvah of knowledge of Hashem, you need to know two things, Maaseh Merkava and Maaseh Bereishis, and they're different. We can then align those two principles of Maaseh Merkava and Maaseh Bereishis to the two expressions the Rambam uses, Dvarim Astumim and Das Boiram. Right? Maaseh Merkava, Maaseh Bereishis. When he tells us that we'll know the secrets, without saying it's the secrets of the Creator, that means we'll know the secrets of creation. That even though this is the understanding of things that are made up of both matter and form, but they're very profound concepts. Right? Understanding. Remember, matter and form also includes spiritual things as well. Which means that these are deeply profound and complex systems that are not immediately apparent to the human eye and to the human mind. These are hidden things, they're very deep things. You need a tremendous amount of intellectual resource to be able to truly understand these things and appreciate them. Therefore, Rambam calls them the hidden things, because the human mind doesn't automatically appreciate and understand them. But it is, after all, the story of creation, and we're part of creation, so therefore it's within the human realm to be able to understand these things. And so, we'll know those secrets when Mashiach comes. But then after that we get to something far more advanced, to understand the Eibishter's mind, so to speak. Now we're talking about much more lofty things. We're talking about Ma'aser Merkava, the spiritual realities. That even angels that are effectively energy without physical form. It's quite difficult for us. It's impossible for us, actually, because our reality is that we're made out of physical form, as well as obviously physical matter, as well as obviously form. We can't really get to a true comprehension of these things, because something that's outside of our reality, we just simply don't have the tools to be able to understand. But now that's malachim. How much more so than when we're talking about the Eibishter's wisdom or knowledge. The Rambam says clearly there is no way that a human being who is a composite of a soul locked into a body should be able to begin to understand anything about the Eibishter's true self. Therefore, when the Rambam is talking about the fact that in the time of Mashiach we'll have an appreciation of the Eibishter's reality, he has to say a disclaimer, to the extent of human ability. And that also explains why in that context the Rambam finishes off the pasuk saying that the knowledge will be like the sea that covers the ocean bed of a hektim. Just to explain what that means. The big difference between Ma'aser Merkava and Ma'aser Bereishis, which, as the Rambam points out, is that the concepts of Ma'aser Bereishis are not as deep and profound as the concept of Ma'aser Merkava. That's why there's a practical difference to who you teach each subject to and how many people you can teach each subject to, because Ma'aser Merkava is much more subtle, much more abstract, much more profound. It's not for everybody. Even Ma'aser Bereishis is not for everybody, but Ma'aser Merkava is much more limited, as the Rambam tells us. This is not just the difference in terms of how much there is to understand. That the topics of Ma'aser Merkava are far deeper than the topics of Ma'aser Bereishis. It's a completely different league of understanding. It's a different technology of understanding. Understanding creation, seeing as it is part and parcel of creation, of which we are a participant. So how do you understand things about the nature of creation? You explore, you research, and then you come to understand. This is how that process works. This is what this organism is. This is this particular ecosystem. Whereas when you're trying to understand things which are so abstract, like Ma'aser Merkava, now you're trying to understand things that are in the realm of creator, not creation. It's not my world. It's actually impossible for me to have positive knowledge of these things. All I can know is exclusionary information. I know that it's not this. It's like very often you ask a person to define spirituality. They say, not physical. Now, that's not necessarily the most ideal explanation, but what they're illustrating is not my reality. So I don't know how to define it. I can only exclude it from things that I'm aware of. As the Rambam goes into great detail in Moreh HaNevuchim and tells us that you actually cannot apply any title to the Eibishter as an absolute. So, for example, to say that Hashem is great is not appropriate. Hashem is kind, it's not appropriate. All you could say is exclusionary descriptions, which means when we're referring to the Eibishter as wise, says the Rambam, that means what we mean is that we exclude anything that is unwise, or anything that is irrational, or anything that is immature. That cannot apply to the Eibishter. So I don't know what the Eibishter's Chochmah looks like, but I know that I'm excluding anything which would be disparaging, anything which would be not wisdom. The same with everything else. Right? I'm not saying the Eibishter is kind. I'm excluding any possibility for anything that is not kindness. Therefore, I don't have a means to be able to give definitions and say, okay, I know what the Eibishter is, or I know how the Eibishter operates. You can't. You can say, I know what doesn't limit the Eibishter. That's acceptable. Now, the reality is, even knowing something by exclusion is still a form of knowledge. And as the Rambam says, the more things you exclude, the clearer you become on what it is that you're trying to understand. All of these exclusionary clauses make us that much closer to understanding something positive about the Eibishter. Even if you get to the most advanced dimension of exclusionary understanding, you still won't know anything about the Eibishter's self, about the Eibishter's essence, because all you're doing is you're saying, it's not that, it's not that, it's not that. The truth of his existence is always going to remain infinitely beyond us. And that's why you see that the Rambam uses different descriptive language when talking about Maaseh Bereishis versus Maaseh Merkava. When the Rambam's describing the understanding of these higher das haboire, the Eibishter's reality, he says, he says, whatever I've explained about this is literally a drop in the ocean compared to what should be said about it. Whereas when he talks about how much information he's shared about the understanding of the creative process, there he says, he says, what I've explained over here is a drop in the bucket. Now obviously there's a big difference between saying a drop in a bucket and a drop in the ocean. And based on what we've taught so far, it's pretty clear why he's making that distinction. Because even though the concepts of creation are very profound, the reality is they are finite concepts because we're talking about a finite creation. And if it might be above my intellectual pay grade, it still has its limits. Therefore, in spite of the fact that Rambam only spoke in broad strokes about these topics, which is why saying this is just a drop compared to how much information is out there. But it is a relative drop. It's a drop in a bucket. Because yes, a bucket is much more than a single drop, but it is a very finite container, implying that the information about Maaseh Bereishis, profound as it is, has its limits. Whereas when the Rambam says what I've told you about Maaseh Merkava is a drop, he says it's a drop in the ocean. Because conceptually an ocean represents something which is without end. Which is why halachically we consider water of an ocean to be water without end. So, like for example, if a person disappears in the ocean, we call it Maim Shein Lahem Sof. So you don't know what happened. Maybe he landed up being disgorged somewhere else, a few kilometers down the beach, because it's Ein Lahem Sof. We can't see the end of that water. You stand on the beach, can't see the end of the ocean. Now, of course, we know that the water of the ocean is in fact limited. In fact, the Gemara even tells us there's a possibility of people who know how to calculate how much water is in the sea. But the fact that we colloquially refer to the ocean as without end implies that there's so much water in the ocean that the Torah is willing to refer to it as without end. So therefore, conceptually, a drop in the ocean is a drop in an infinite amount. Whatever you're going to learn about Maaseh Merkava, it's not even going to begin to scrape the beginning. Whereas Maaseh Bereishis, whatever you learn, it might be a drop, but it's a drop in a bucket. So you're getting something quantifiable of the information. In fact, there's another layer to this principle about how the ocean is so infinite. Mikra Mole Dibra Kosev, the pasuk tells us, all rivers lead to the sea, which is a geographical fact, and yet the sea is not filled. In other words, they keep flowing, keep flowing, keep flowing. Right? So the message is, the sea never gets to a point of saturation. So therefore, when we say that the sea, that the ocean is water without an end, that means the fact that you can keep adding and adding and adding water to the sea and it never gets to a point of supersaturation, that implies that it really is infinite. But practically, you can calculate how much water is currently in the ocean. But potentially, the water, the ocean never gets filled by all of this water, and therefore it is considered to be water without end. Because Ma'aser Merkava deals with topics that are completely outside of the realm of the created structure, therefore we compare it allegorically to an ocean which is without end. Which explains why the Rambam also includes the end of the pasuk, that the knowledge of Hashem in the time of Mashiach will be like the ocean. The Rambam is alluding to the fact that yes, when Mashiach comes, we'll have this incredible insight, and we'll be able to understand the Eibishter's knowledge to the extent of human ability. But the reality is, we're talking about the Eibishter's knowledge. It will always be infinitely beyond any created being, like an ocean. And therefore, the only real appreciation that I can have of the subject matter is only to know what I don't know, but not necessarily to know it clearly. Now, seeing how the Rambam teaches us these principles, and where he teaches us these principles, that leaves us with a lesson about how we're supposed to engage with these profound areas of Torah. Right in his introduction, the Rambam says, that in his first book, he's going to include all of the mitzvahs that are fundamental to following the dictates, the doctrine of Moshe Rabbeinu. And they are so foundational that a person has to know these principles before they know everything else. And that implies that this Sefer Hamada, if Sefer Hamada is the foundation of the rest of Judaism, then what is put at the beginning of Sefer Hamada and what he calls Hilchos Yesodei HaTorah, these are the foundational principles of Torah. It's pretty clear that the Rambam wants us to learn these things even before we learn the other core principles of Judaism in Sefer Hamada. And it's pretty clear that the Rambam wants us to know these things even before we get into the topics that will be throughout the other 13 books of the Sefer Yad HaChazaka. So you have Sefer Hamada, which is the beginning of the whole process of learning. Hilchos Yesodei HaTorah is the beginning of the process of Sefer Hamada. The beginning of Hilchos Yesodei HaTorah is the first thing we have to know is the foundation of all foundations and the pillar of all wisdom. And seeing as the Rambam has shown us that these 4 chapters, which speak about these 5 mitzvahs, to know the Eibishter, to know that the Eibishter is one, etc., to love him, to fear him, etc. That the Rambam says, well, all of this was incorporated by our sages in what's called Pardes. The Rambam is telling us all of this information is critical information in order for us to fulfill the very first mitzvah, which is to know the Eibishter, which is the foundation of everything. The Rambam is clearly telling us not only do we have to know these things, but we have to know them first. But then there's a problem because the Rambam seems to say something that might contradict that, because it says Vani Omer. You shouldn't go kind of hiking through this paradise and a mission is until you filled yourself with the basics, meat and bread, which is basically halacha. You first have to know what's right and what's wrong, and then you can have the luxury of indulging in the mystical. Now that seems to imply sounds like you're only supposed to delve into these principles about the creation and Ma'aser Merkava only once you have got a good grounding in the more practical parts of Torah, what you may or may not do. Besides which, the Rambam said furthermore, Ba'agdama Sifrei Kosav Rambam, in his introduction, the Rambam writes, first, a person should read the whole of Tanakh. Then you read the Mishnah Torah. And through that, he'll know all of the things that are relevant to the oral Torah. You don't have to read anything else. In other words, he's saying that after a person learns Torah Shebichsav, you don't have to go into all the other books. You don't have to go into all the Gemara, etc. The first thing he says is, come to my book. The first thing in his book, Ma'aser Bereishis, Ma'aser Merkava. So which one is it? Are you supposed to first fill yourself up on halacha and then get into the mystical, or are you supposed to dive straight into the mystical? So especially when you consider these 4 chapters the Rambam included in his sefer, a sefer that the Rambam said is for everybody, even the smallest, so to speak, least knowledgeable Jew. It's pretty clear that if you're referring to somebody as a, so to speak, small Jew, the implication is that they haven't yet filled themselves up on halacha. So which one is it? Are we supposed to dive straight into the mystical, or are we supposed to first learn halacha? Rabbi said this is why you have to pay attention to the Rambam's language. The Rambam was very specific when he said you shouldn't go spaziering, you shouldn't go kind of strolling through the paradise. And it's very different to the Gemara that he's effectively basing himself on, where the expression was to enter paradise, that there were sages who entered paradise. When you say letayil, you don't just mean to enter a particular area. It implies you're spending time there, and it's an enjoyable experience. You're strolling around. In other words, what he's saying is, to get into such deep level of appreciation and knowledge of these topics is to the extent that it's something that you actually personally enjoy. You can only do that once you've filled yourself with the basics. And that's why the Rambam says we don't go advertising these deep mystical concepts to just everybody, because to get into a thorough learning of mysticism, you first have to do the basics. But the principles that he teaches in the first 4 prakim of Mishnah Torah, that he doesn't get into that level of detail. As the Rambam himself made a point of telling us. He's telling us clearly that whatever I'm sharing here is a drop in the ocean. And with when Ma'aser Bereishis, it says it's a drop in the bucket. Because it's not even as if he's just giving us the headlines. As the Rambam says, even the core principles of Ma'aser Merkava you don't advertise publicly. He's not even giving us that level of detail. He's giving us general but foundational principles. And therefore this is not contravening the problem of strolling around and investing and learning all the elaborate spirituality which you're not supposed to do until you filled yourself with the basics. On the other hand, but these core principles, as the Rambam presents them, these core principles you've got to learn up front. Because this is the foundation of all foundations and the pillar of all wisdom. That a person should have absolute awareness of Hashem's existence. The whole of Judaism is going to be built on this foundation. You have to have this foundation. And not just, as he said in the beginning, in a generic way, but in a detailed way. And if we engage in knowing the Eibishter to the best of our ability now, that will very quickly take us into the time of Mashiach. The time at which the Rambam describes the only occupation of the world will be simply to know the Eibishter. That the world will be filled with the knowledge of the Eibishter, like the ocean is filled with the water of the sea, and that should happen in Hashem right now.